Hi, everyone. I'm David Highfill. I'm a member of the board of the Spencertown Academy Arts Center. Welcome to our Festival of Books. We're virtual this year, as you know, and not in the outdoor tent behind our historic 1847 building. But we have a very strong program again this year, and I want to thank you for joining us. We're very fortunate tonight to have Robert Kolker, who's here to talk about his book, Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. This extraordinary narrative nonfiction is really part family drama and part medical mystery. It's about the Galvin family, in which 6 of 12 kids were diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller, was featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. It was a selection of the Oprah Book Club, quite a publishing feat, honestly, and wholly and richly deserved. Robert is also the author of Lost Girls, which Time magazine called one of the great true crime books of all time. He's an award-winning journalist who's written lots of cover stories over many years at New York Magazine. He was writing at Bloomberg Businessweek as well. He lives in Brooklyn with his family. Seth Rogovoy is here tonight to have a conversation with him. Seth is a real Renaissance man, as many of you know. He's the author of books on Bob Dylan and klezmer music. He's a producer, editor, teacher, musician, as well as publisher of the Rogovoy Report, the online magazine. He lives in Hudson and New York. We'll have a Q&A period following the discussion. Feel free to submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button on the information bar at the bottom of your screen. A quick note about some programming things this weekend as well. Richard Gere, who's the author of a book about the New Yorker cartoonists and some of their work, we'll be in a conversation with Gerald Seligman this Saturday, September 12th at 4:30. And Ed Ward, the author of The History of Rock and Roll, will be here on Sunday, September 13th at 4:30. All the programs are free, but you need to register online the day before the event. Also of note is our online specialty bookstore, which we're featuring with the Festival of Books. 99% of our proceeds for this sale and donations go toward our programming and annual budget. So these events and the funds they raise are crucial to us, to our survival. Please visit us on the web at spencertownacademy.org for more about this unique book sale and our future programs. About purchasing Bob's book also, consider supporting your local independent bookstore. Here, Chatham Bookstore will give you a 10% discount if you mention the Festival of Books. And a last note as well about today's session, if there's a technological glitch anywhere today, please bear with us. We're in good hands, but stuff does happen. We'll be working to fix it as quickly as we can. So please join me in welcoming Bob Kolker and Seth Rogovoy.
Thanks, David. It's a great honor for me to be here with Bob Kolker. This book, Hidden Valley Road, which is fantastic. It's a gripping read. It's mind-blowing, and it's the kind of book that wins the Pulitzer Prize. Bob, can you talk about how and when you first heard about the Galvin family and their plight, and when the idea for a book, it's kind of a chicken and the egg question, I guess, in some way, which came first, and how did you become aware of them?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you, Seth, for taking the time to be a part of this event. And I'm really thrilled to be a part of this book festival and really grateful to Spencertown Academy for putting it together. I was just before the program, I was saying to Seth and David and everyone that, this age of Zoom, it was anybody's guess whether people would show up to actually hear about books or to visit with authors. And I'm finding that the reception has really been wonderful. And so I'm really, really grateful. My career really took shape at New York Magazine, where I was a generalist and really did anything that they threw at me in the beginning. But then I started to specialize. I wrote about, I wasn't the one who they would necessarily put in front of the mayor or in front of a movie star or a billionaire. They would often asked me to write about everyday people who never imagined that they would get media coverage, quite often because they were going through something extraordinary or perhaps even tragic. And I think I got cast in that role as a magazine writer time and time again, because I was a narrative journalist who really wanted to write intimately about people's emotional lives. And so some of that was crime writing and criminal justice writing, but other stories involved science and business and other subjects. And then my first book, Lost Girls, was about an unsolved murder case, but I really focused on 5 troubled families connected to the case and wrote about their trials and tribulations. And so when the Galvin family first was looking for someone to tell their story to, my editor my old editor, a good friend of mine, John Gluck, who was at New York Magazine with me, he was the one who connected us. Now the family has 12 children, and they're all boys except for the 2 youngest, the 2 sisters. And it was the sisters who decided that there ought to be a book. And they had been thinking about it for years and finally realized it was so complex and so difficult, particularly the science end of it, that they wanted an impartial journalist to do it, not for them, but as an independent book. And so as it turned out, the younger of the 2 sisters, Lindsay, went to high school with John Gluck, with my friend. So she contacted him. He said, I know a guy, because that essentially was, I was a good match for the material in that way. And when I first talked to them, it was about 4 years ago on the phone, and I could hardly believe their story. I should say at this point that I never once imagined before this moment that I'd be writing a big book about schizophrenia, that mental illness as a subject was interesting to me, but I never thought I want to do a book on that. It was the family's story, their emotional journey, that really appealed to me. And the fact that it was such a large family, and that I would be writing about really a multi-generational saga, where you'd get to know the parents as they met and married and had kids, and then get to know the kids as they grow up and rethink everything they thought about their family. That part really appealed to me. And from those first conversations, I saw it would be a heavy lift, but certainly worth trying. It really took a year to learn enough about the family to really justify putting a book together. And then after that point, I really hit the ground running.
I was wondering about how long the process was, because in the end, it's really an epic tale. I mean, literally time-wise, it goes with just the family, and you do even more than the family, because you go even further back in time to set the scene for our understanding of mental illness. But even the family alone, we're talking 70, 80 years almost. So my question is how long did you work on this, and how many people did you wind up talking to over time, and what kept you going?
Well, that initial conversation in early 2016 was with the 2 sisters, and they told me, basically they laid it all out for me right there in that first conversation, and it was horrifying to hear. There was so much suffering that they went through and that the whole family went through. There wasn't just mental illness and hospitalizations. There was sexual abuse. There was a murder-suicide. There was a lot of police activity at the house. Illnesses. It gets very, very grim. And I couldn't imagine that the family even stayed together, much less that it all could happen to one family. But then they also were hopeful, because they believed that their family had something to share with people, that there was some scientific significance, that of course researchers have been desperate for clues to figure out what causes schizophrenia and what the hereditary element is of it, and that a family like this might hold those clues. So my initial reaction to this was, this is going to be impossible. There are 12 children, some of whom are deceased, but then there are 2 parents. You've got to include all these different perspectives and juggle it and help people understand who's who. Then the living people actually have to be interested in talking about very sensitive matters that happen to them, about medical information that is private. A lot of people here on the Zoom might know about the HIPAA laws, the medical privacy laws. You can't, I can't just go and call up a hospital and get your medical records. Everybody has to consent. And so I thought, well, here, I came up with an idea. I said to the sisters, I said, it's spring. What if once a week I spent an hour and got on the phone with somebody in your family or a medical person who has researched your family and talked for an hour, and just shot the breeze with them, and taped the call, but said, not a formal interview, but just I would open with the question for each of them. So the sisters are interested in having a book published about your family. How does that make you feel? And then just talk to them about it. And I said, well, after the end of 10 or 11 or 12 weeks, by the end of the summer, we'll all know one way or another whether this is actually a reasonable idea, whether somebody stands up and says no way, or whether everybody's up for it. And if somebody says no, I would give the tapes, the recordings to the sisters, and it would be my good deed for the year, and I would move on, and they could go and work on a memoir or however else they might want to do it. But I was amazed to see that everybody was up for it. And what I hadn't counted on, actually I hadn't counted on two things. The first was that decades had gone by since a lot of the most difficult things happened in this family. So everybody had done a lot of work to sort of move past the trauma. So they were slightly more open to talking about it than if I had come to them in 1985. But the second thing was that the two sisters in the family, as the youngest ones, really were the recipients of a lot of the difficulties in the family. They stayed at home the longest. A lot of the troubles that the older brothers had trickled down to them. They were abused sexually by one brother. And so going to the rest of the family and asking about this, their reaction was, well, if the sisters want this, then who am I to say no? They deferred to the sisters. And so between those two things, I went off to Colorado where the family lived, and I met Mimi Galvin, the family matriarch, who was 91 and in failing health, and interviewed her. She was thrilled to be able to do this because she felt that the science that the family had contributed was significant. And then a year after I talked to them, I had a book proposal ready, which was a lot of work, but also I was able to tell publishers I'd been working on this for a year, which is also, gives them a lot of confidence too.
Right. Certainly in reading the book, a reader is struck by how everybody is talking to you. And not only everybody in the family, but all the doctors, obviously because they gave permission, but it's rather almost odd that they were all, or even half of them, so willing and forthcoming. I mean, I understand the sisters in particular. Do you have any explanation for why the brothers were all willing?
They were ready to. They were ready to talk about their memories because a lot of time had gone by, and also because I'd spent so much time with the family up before the book had sold that they kind of understood where I was coming from. And also there were some breaking news about this family, not that had been reported anywhere, but medical researchers had found out a few things about them genetically in recent years so they understood that would be a big part of the book as well. So everybody was sort of motivated. But the intimacy you speak of was exciting to me. I'm a narrative nonfiction writer. This is my second book, but I really model my career after people who are like titans in the field, like Catherine Boo, who wrote Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, or Michael Lewis, who writes, so many amazing narratives. David Simon, who before The Wire wrote terrific narrative nonfiction about criminal justice in Baltimore. These are people who are using, really, really propulsive, descriptive, intimate, heavily reported writing to help lift the veil on a part of the world that you otherwise never would get to see, and perhaps didn't even know you were interested in. I mean, this summer I read Beyond the Beautiful Forevers. It's about the slums of Mumbai and about families there. And it's like reading Oliver Twist. I mean, you get caught up in it and all the dramas between all the different families. It's exciting. And suddenly I know more about life in that part of the world than I ever imagined I would. And so my hope was to do something like that for families who are touched by acute mental illness and by the science of mental illness, which is so mysterious, that you come for the family drama and you stay for the medical mystery.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you utterly and totally succeeded in pulling that off, no doubt. You touched on something that I wanted to raise, and that is, we say 6 out of the 12 were diagnosed with schizophrenia or some kind of mental illness. But really, what I'm struck with is how this was it's a family crisis. The other 6 were, and the parents obviously, utterly and totally affected, nearly as much as if they had the mental illness themselves, even though they didn't, because it's such a family crisis. To say nothing of the abuse that extended to everyone.
Right. I mean, it's not just that 6 of the sons are getting sick one after the other. It's that the other 6 children are wondering when they go to bed at night, who's next? When they wake up in the morning, will someone else be sick, or will they be the one who's sick? And then there's also, among the girls especially, there was this motivation to be perfect in every way and to not give your parents any trouble, because you're on eggshells the whole time, because if you got a B on a test, then there was a fear that your mother would turn and go, are you becoming mentally ill? I mean, the paranoia in the house was justified because it was happening to so many people. Everybody was living under a microscope.
Right. It was also, it's just mind-boggling how, so all of this trouble and drama and, horror is happening within this family, in this house of 14 people. And then even the world outside is impinging on them, because some of the kids were abused by people outside of, as if it weren't bad enough what was going on inside, the world was also abusing and hurting these people.
Yes, there's clergy abuse in the book. It seems as if a priest mistreated at least one, if not more, of the sons. And then that's seized upon by the mother later in the book as a possible reason for some of the other abuse that happens. And of course, it's anybody's guess if that's the case.
Right.
It was not lost on me that the family spans the baby boom, that the oldest son is born in 1945 and the youngest in 1965, the youngest, the younger of the 2 girls. So you've got, 12 children over 20 years, but right in the middle of the American century, this period of optimism. And then the first, right like clockwork, the first sons to become mentally ill, it happens in their early 20s, which is the late 60s, just as the country's going berserk. And from that very first phone call with the sisters, it made me think of American Pastoral, of Philip Roth's novel, which is about a much smaller family, but about a family that is perfect in every way and a model to others, and filled with incredible privilege and optimism and perfection until they blow up. They blow up quite literally in the same period of time. And so I had that on my mind too in talking about this family. And of course, in reality, the Galvin family did think about the counterculture and wondered, well, is it the rebellious times we're living in? Is it all the pot the kids are smoking? Like, what's really happening here?
Right. You've anticipated one of my other points I wanted to bring up and ask you about, and that is this idea that in some way the Galvin family was a picture of the American dream, and that it becomes the American nightmare. On some level, should we read this story as allegory? Is this actually, are the Galvins America, or is America the Galvins?
It's hard to escape it. I mean, the facts are there. I mean, you've got the patriarch of the family, Don, is a veteran of World War II. He served in the South Pacific. Then he flips over to the Air Force and is one of the first people who's part of the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. It's his idea to make the Falcon the US Air Force mascot. He flies the Falcons at football games all around the country. He's known around town as the Falcon guy. The boys all are his assistant Falconers. They are and of course they also are all-state athletes. And Don Jr., the oldest of the 12, is dating the daughter of the general at the Air Force Academy. Another son is in a rock band in the 60s that the general allows them to rehearse in his garage. Like it could not be more American. At one point, Lucille Ball is traveling through the academy and comes and visits the band and shakes everybody in the band's hand. I mean, we're talking about a very American story at a very particular time in American history, which is filled with not just optimism, but triumphalism. And yet you have this thing happened out of nowhere that no one can control. And it's happening to a family that believes they can control it all. And so that you can take from that what you want to think about what happens to a country that befalls hard times, that thinks they can control everything.
Right, and that there's something. I mean, obviously, in the family, the question of genetics, but even culturally or politically, socioculturally, that there's some kind of genetic defect or mutation. Getting back to the mental illness part, because the story, as much as it is about the Galvins, you also take us along through the whole history of understanding and research of just what this mental illness is, how you define it, is it really a thing, or is it a collection of other things? One of the notions that really grabbed onto me was that there is some kind of mental illness spectrum, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And sure. Is this still something that researchers or authorities are pursuing as a possible answer, if there is such a thing?
Well, now that the human genome has been sequenced, there are more and more studies that are finding genetic areas in common with people who have various mental illnesses, suggesting that there's a spectrum. Specifically, I think it's the bipolar and schizophrenia and autism that appear to have some overlap in some studies. So it's possible you could have you could have something genetic happening that just manifests differently depending on who you are. And that certainly is how genetic diseases sometimes work. It's not like a computer program where you inherit a blueprint that you are definitely going to get schizophrenia at the age of 21. You inherit a vulnerability that can manifest itself any number of ways, perhaps depending on some environmental triggers. So maybe you end up with one thing or another thing. So that's a very tantalizing idea to suspect that they might be related. And then on the other side, there are things like depression and anxiety, which appear to be relatives or close cousins as well, where you see some of the same drugs are prescribed for depression as are for anxiety. That's no coincidence. There seem to be some genetic commonalities as well. But long before that, the genetic pattern of schizophrenia has been this huge mystery and a huge matter of debate. Everybody seems to know that it pops up in families, but nobody knows how. It doesn't seem to go from parent to child. It wanders and meanders in families in ways that people don't expect. And so a family like the Galvin presents this amazing opportunity. You can look at the Galvins, and if you study their genes, perhaps see something they all have in common that sticks out like a sore thumb. And that's the big hope that they presented. And they did, in fact, have a couple of things, but it's never that simple. So I learned so much about mental illness and about schizophrenia while working on this book. I mean, I'm 50. For my adult life, since around 1990, like for the last 30 years, my understanding of mental illness was that it's about brain chemistry, right? And that if somebody had depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, that was about finding the right drug to alter your brain chemistry to fix the problem. And if you're lucky enough to find the drug that works, you're back in the saddle, and it's all good. But what I learned about schizophrenia is that the drugs that are that are prescribed for that are not as miraculous, that they're basically the same drugs they've been using since the 50s and 60s, and that they are symptom suppressors. They zone you out and make you more manageable as a patient, but they don't necessarily make you a functional person. And there's been no innovation over that long. And just imagine having a disease where there's been no move forward to prescribe. After all we've come forward with diabetes and heart disease, and even Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, there's nothing new for schizophrenia. And partly it's because the people don't speak up for themselves. They're compromised and they aren't a constituency that can really rally as well as people with cancer, for instance. And the other part of it is that there's this huge stigma that we want to put people away and warehouse them and get them out of our minds so that we don't have to think about them. All this was or much of it was really new to me as I was learning about schizophrenia.
Right. So it's the disappointment of the failure of innovation in the treatment of the disease. Yet you recount a lot of discoveries and a lot of potential connections and theories which have happened over the course of time. Through no fault of yours, we get to the end of the book and there isn't an answer.
Right.
There's not a wow, like it's solved, case closed. Do you think, given all that all the doctors and researchers you spoke with, that there is at some point going to be, or is this just an elusive disease that is beyond our thinking and our paradigms of what a disease is?
We certainly know more about it than we ever have. But the paradigm point you just made is a really good one, because there may be no it. Schizophrenia is a word we've come up with to define a collection of symptoms. It is not a specific illness the way that COVID-19 is an illness. Like, you can look at COVID-19 in a microscope and say, yep, that's COVID-19. There's nothing like that for schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a classification of symptoms. So it could be that 40 years from now, what doctors may diagnose as schizophrenia may be diagnosed as 6 different types of brain disorders or developmental disorders with 6 different biological markers that make it clear that they are different from one another. With schizophrenia might not be schizophrenia coming on for now. And that, to me, that paradigm is hopeful because it pitches things forward. I feel like we get now that there is a genetic underpinning, but we're not so hooked on isolating a smoking gun. But now we can work on early interventions and on finding out exactly whether these illnesses are actually discrete illnesses that are different from one another. That part is exciting. And the best way of describing this, on the chance that I have completely confused people by my discussions of science, is a quote from one researcher. He told me, hundreds of years ago, people had fevers, and that was the disease. The disease was fever. Like, how are we going to cure fever? And then, years go by, and we learn that fever isn't the disease. Fever is a symptom. It's what happens when any number of things happen. Could be a virus, could be an infection. And so that could be what we decide, what we realize that acute mental illness is. Schizophrenia could just be our body's way of reacting when our brain's way of reacting when it isn't working so great, and it just manifests this as a symptom. And it's the glitch in the brain that we really need to get a handle on.
Right. Now, so you're working on this for a number of years. I was wondering, how did it affect you personally, when you're immersed in this and with these people, both how did it affect you personally, emotionally, and did you struggle in any way with keeping your writerly distance from getting too wrapped up in the incredibly emotional story?
I had 2 enormous technical challenges. One was to write about 12 children and 2 parents without yeah, and well, keeping all the characters straight and not driving readers, to distraction, trying to figure out exactly who's who and what's what, and to tell a story that you actually could follow. So I was madly looking for models of that. I read War and Peace, which has 1 million characters, to see, well, how did he do it? And I saw, like, yeah, you could spend an entire chapter on just one character and it's cool, it's okay. It actually is better than trying to do chapters where you have 20 people doing 20 different things. So that was one technical challenge. And then the other challenge was to try to make some sense of the discussion of schizophrenia. And for that, I looked at other nonfiction books that use captivating human stories to try to lay bare difficult concepts. So Michael Lewis is a perfect example. Like, you could be reading The Blind Side or Moneyball, and you could be wrapped up in the saga of, are they going to win the game or lose the game? And then suddenly he'll cut over at just the right moment and give you some very, very technical information about something you never thought you might be interested in, but it's coming at just the right moment that really it's exciting to you because it raises the stakes of the narrative. And then he cuts right back to the narrative before you get bored or before it feels like homework. And so my ambition with this book was to try to do that too, to try to get you enough of the history of mental illness to raise the stakes for the Galvin family story, but not so much that it felt like you were taking a college class. Because at heart, I really feel like this is a family story with science woven in and not a case study that should be taught in colleges. Although if they want to teach it in colleges, that's fine too.
Right. I'm wondering, curious, have the Galvins, have any of them, I assume that they have read the book, and what kind of feedback have you gotten from them?
I think that everybody's feeling really good about it now. There was a period where I showed it to them maybe a month or two before it was published, when it was basically too late to make any significant changes. Maybe I could change a word or two here or there for second printings. But and they were, and some people were thinking, well, this isn't what I was expecting, or I thought this was going to be one thing or not another. And I had a lot of very deep conversations with a lot of the family members about what they were expecting versus what this was. But I think their concern was natural. It's what any human being would think if somebody dropped in from the sky and wrote a book about you. You'd think, well, this isn't exactly what I would do myself. But then suddenly the book had this amazing reception, including Oprah Winfrey saying, how sympathetic everybody came off as, and how relatable their saga is. And that really solved a lot of problems, to be honest. I mean, the lots of different family members then suddenly realized, oh, this book isn't coming off the way that I thought it was. I'm just being self-conscious. It's clearly coming off as this well-intentioned, high-minded, non-exploitative book. And so everybody was very, very happy after that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, knowing how book publishing works a little bit, I assume that you basically turned in your manuscript about at least a year ago?
Yeah, and I was really, really gunning for it to come out in the fall of 2019 because I didn't want to be anywhere near the election year. I didn't want to be preempted by any sort of political books that would come out, and I didn't quite make that goal, which turned out to be a good thing because I think the fall is a very competitive time to publish a nonfiction book. So spring of 2020 was still fine as far as I was concerned, because it was far. If you look at the publishing season now, starting after Labor Day, it's all about the election or about something vaguely related to the election. There would be no way to have any impact with a book like this now. So it still felt fine. But that meant a lot of waiting time, a bit of a lag, sitting there and drumming your fingernails and wondering, will it come across? And as you know, these big nonfiction books, they're like, you're swinging for the bleachers, and the book could just sink like a stone because of something that happens in the news that week. And then of course came the virus, and that was troubling too, not just for a book, but for all of us. It turns out to be much more important than anything else that was going on. And so it it's been a tremendous relief that it's found readers despite that.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, since you must have finished it over a year ago, have you been working on something? You know, that's often one way to like get out of the waiting around period. Is something bubbling up? Have you been working on your next book? What is it?
I don't have anything specific. I have some subject areas that I'm researching, and I just sort of have to have confidence that they'll lead me in the right direction. Even if that subject area winds up not being the next book, it'll get me, any road will take me to whatever the next thing is.
Right.
But for this season, for the election season, I'm hunkering in, teaching a journalism class at NYU, and trying to fire up lots of shorter things as well. So it's interesting. Like the kind of books I do take a lot of advanced work. So who knows? Maybe I'll find something now but it'll take a year for it to really gel.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. I'm wondering if maybe it's time that we invite our audience in and for questions. I'm imagining people have all kinds of things they want to hear about from you. David, you want to take it from here?
Definitely. So everybody, please use the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen and offer some questions if you'd like. There are a few here. This is a good one. I think it's still agreed that there's an environmental component to this disease. There is an environmental component to this disease. I was struck by the level of violence and anger and jealousy in the Galvin family, specifically the boys. What if the first 10 children had been girls?
That's a really interesting thought experiment to have. Your point about the environmental component to the disease is a really strong one, Jill. The discussion of nature and nurture has really never left us. And even in the age of the genome, where we think we can find the culprit in our genes, what we're learning with schizophrenia is that you don't inherit the gene to get the illness, you inherit a vulnerability. And you could live your whole life with this vulnerability and never manifest an illness unless perhaps something happens in the environment. And as far as psychiatrists know, that something else could be any number of things, not just negative things, could be positive things, like the experience of leaving home and going off to college could be seen as your body could process it as a stressor, and suddenly it could activate something going on in your brain development. Because our brains don't stop developing until post-adolescence, there's a lot of time for that vulnerability to take shape. So for your question, this was a rowdy household, hard to tell whether it was parental neglect or aloofness or just the sensibility of parenting of the times that let things get so out of hand, or whether it was the early stages of mental illness in some of the boys that led to a lot of the violence between them and a lot of the bullying. But if they were girls, you could certainly imagine it manifesting itself slightly differently with less, with less cultural tolerance of that sort of behavior. So I think that point is spot on.
This is a question about challenges in writing. What was the biggest challenge in writing this book, which I thought was terrific, one question says.
Thank you. Just keeping all the, I was concerned that the reader would throw up their hands and say, 12 children, 2 parents, there's no way I'll get everybody straight. Plus it's a American Catholic family, so it's all names like, Matthew and Mark and John and Don, I'm never going to be able to tell them apart. And so I really, really sweated that, trying to find a way to make sure that the story flowed in a way that helped you understand them. I made the sisters and the mother, actually, I sort of foregrounded them so that the reader would know that you could come back to them from time to time. And then everybody else I sort of jobbed in at just the right moment to try and accomplish something different. But it took a lot of moving around, and I really credit my editor, Chris Popolo. She was wonderful working with me on that. It became an amazing jigsaw puzzle too. First you make the pieces, and then you assemble the puzzle, and then you build and shave down certain pieces so that it fits in a way that you want. That was the challenge.
I love the design of the book, the way, the chapters that are talking about the family list the names in bold, one of the family members, one of the kids who was going to be the main part of that chapter. I thought that was a great kind of like little refresher thing. It's a small thing, but it was great.
I was really thrilled with how that turned out. It's a little like having a program at a baseball game, and knowing who's up at bat with each chapter. You know who you're going to focus on.
Right, right. Here's another question. Did the brothers exhibit different symptoms of schizophrenia? And if so, what were the different ones? They were very different, right?
Yes, and in a way I could answer this question as I answered the last one, that this was the other big challenge of the book, was to write about mental illness in a way that wasn't a monster movie, that wasn't just, and then one brother went crazy, and then the next brother went crazy, and another and another. I wanted to write about them as people, and I wasn't sure how I would be able to differentiate what they went through. But then I met the three surviving mentally ill brothers in person, and I saw that this was going to be actually, that I shouldn't have worried, that they were people, they were human beings, each manifesting illness in a different way. And then learning about the others, it was the same thing. It wasn't like a locked mental ward situation where I would be let into a maximum security area where somebody's in a straitjacket. I mean, these were guys, one was living independently and medicated, and two others are in assisted living. They're sociable, they go out to dinner with the family. So at this stage, you were able to see and get a picture of what they were like before they were sick, as well as how they are now.
Here's another question. I was curious the extent to which you feel the drug use may have opened a window into the madness that may have been avoided without the drug activity.
That's a good question, and it's phrased in my mind perfectly, because the question is, could they have avoided the worst of mental illness without the drug activity? And that begs another question, which is a chicken or egg question, which is, are they taking drugs to self-medicate because they're anxious and uptight because their brains aren't developing the way they should? Or are the drugs triggering the psychosis to begin with, and would they have been all right if they had never taken drugs? And that's a question that requires further study, particularly with marijuana. Apparently that's a controversy right now about whether it's the chicken or the egg, whether it's the cause or the self-medication. And there's not enough known about that. But certainly there is this notion that there's an outside stressor of some sort. Could be a head injury, could be a heartbreak, could be drug use. And so you can't remove it as a possibility.
Here's another more medical question. Genetics has always been factored into the etiology of this illness. I wonder if you encountered any discussion of epigenetics. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I'm saying it right. The influence of environmental factors in previous and remote generations of a family encoded in the epigenome.
I didn't look specifically at ways that previous generations might have had environmental factors encode into the genome. But certainly the idea of genes that are expressed by environmental triggers is something that people are looking at with regard to this illness. You can have a family like this where everybody has the same genetic quirk, but it manifests differently with different brothers, and maybe even one of the sisters has that same genetic quirk but never has schizophrenia. You have to ask yourself what's happening environmentally that might be different among each of them. Who didn't have need 16 stitches in their head from the hockey game, and who didn't have their wife leave them, questions like that.
Right. Here's another question. I loved both books, and Seth touched on something I liked about both, that the issues in both books are not resolved. Many nonfiction books are not like this. They often tell the inside details of an event, reveal all the secrets. Are you interested in stories without clear-cut resolution? P.S. You read War and Peace to prepare? Kudos.
Yeah, I didn't finish War and Peace, I think, until I was revising the book. So it took forever. But yeah, I am interested in stories without a clear-cut resolution. I mean, with Lost Girls, the first book, the general theme of that book is that real life is not like CSI, that you can't just do a couple clicks on the computer and find the genetic match to the missing person that's going to find the clue that will match genetically to the killer who is already in jail for another crime. It's just not, that's not how the real world works. Life is messier and more chaotic, and sometimes the killers are never caught. And sometimes the police don't care. And sometimes it's because of misogyny. Like, it gets more and more wild the more you look at it. But the bottom line for Hidden Valley Road for me is that not every disease is polio. That it's not, that we have this optimistic view of science that as this very, very basic, very, very forward natural progression. And even polio wasn't like this either, by the way. There were various different teams working on it, where there's a problem to solve and there's a moonshot to solve the problem. And then hooray, we solved the problem and we'll never see it again. We've licked the problem. Whereas with many diseases, particularly the complicated ones like cancer or Alzheimer's or schizophrenia, it's a dialectic. There's a whole team of people who are blaming it on one thing and a whole other team of people working independently who are blaming it on another. And they're at war with each other at conferences and in medical journals for years, until finally one of those arguments falls away, or they reach some sort of middle ground, or a new idea comes in that kind of clarifies both. So it's messy, but eventually there is progress, but just not the way that you necessarily predicted. And to me, that's an exciting story to tell, because it feels so true. It feels like the way that the real world works.
But there also has to be, a really satisfying way to tell the story. And I would think in the hands of a lesser writer, it would come off as incomplete and somehow really just not as satisfying, for lack of a better way to say it. But because we know these people so intimately, and you've given us such a full picture of them as people, I think that lack of answers, and it is fine. I remember being, told that all true crime books have to have the ending. They have to have a conviction. But Lost Girls doesn't have that, But it's like a great novel. It's just you found so many layers, and Hidden Valley Road is not unlike that. So,
thank you. Yeah.
Here's another question. How did spending so much time immersed in mental illness change the way you look at people?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I've lived in New York City ever since I came to college in 1987. And so I've seen homelessness on the street, basically every day since then. And quite often it's informed by mental illness or by drug use. And so it's been very easy for a lot of that time for me to look at someone on the street who's suffering and say, well, they're a mentally ill chemical abuser. They have a problem. And then I just move on. And it's a very, very pat way of looking at it. But certainly working on this book made that impossible for me now. Like, now I see Peter Galvin when I see someone on the street. I see that they have a family and that the family hasn't known what to do with them or where they are right now, but they know they'll probably see them in a couple of weeks once they wind up in jail. And I see the whole drama unfolding in an entirely different way.
I bet.
Very eye-opening.
Here's another question. I was fascinated by the matriarch of the family, Mimi. She seemed somewhat overwhelmed and clueless. Do you think she was a victim of her time, of the limited view of what a woman's role was?
I do, in a lot of ways. And I also think it was very easy to vilify her. And I think the book actually, because the children haven't quite grown up yet to reevaluate her, the book is a little hard on her in part one. And then as the children grow up, they start to see a slightly broader view of her, and they don't necessarily absolve everything about her, but they see her with new eyes by part two. Also, there's a whole section in the book about how the leading psychoanalysts in the middle of the 20th century were blaming mothers for schizophrenia and for other mental illnesses as well.
So, and she did speak up one time. She did come after the academics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To say, well, I'm going to take him back to the hospital. I don't know if that was Peter or Donald or who that was, but.
Yeah. She got blamed, and she said, well, forget it. It's not me. I'm going to, there was this is part of the messiness of the science story. on one side, you've got the psychoanalysts who are blaming mothers, and on the other side, you've got the medical psychiatrists who are dispensing pills like Thorazine, which suppress the symptoms but don't cure the disease. So you're between a rock and a hard place, and neither position is necessarily the right way to go. Oh, and then there's a third way, which would be lobotomy or shock therapy. Like, there are no good choices in that time, and nothing but stigma for a family that's going through it. So Mimi might have been naive and might have been very not prepared for what was going on, but few people would have been given those choices.
Here's another question. We have time for a few more. Do you know of any other families where there were also several cases of schizophrenia?
Yes, and there's a whole through line in this book that one of the most prominent researchers to study this family is a woman who made it her life's work to collect information on families just like them. This was probably the biggest one in her collection, but there are other families like them who she's put, they're called multiplex families, where it's not just necessarily brothers and sisters, but parents and aunts and uncles and cousins. She's trying to get entire families together into a collection of DNA that she can study. And it's been a little like she was ahead of her time doing it in the 80s, but now time has caught up with her now that we can sequence the genome.
Here's one more. I was struck by how differently socioeconomic factors impact treatment options. Not that the boys had a positive experience, but they weren't in prison or solitary for most of their lives. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because this is a very middle class, middle of the road family. They had one set of wealthy friends that helped them in some ways, but apart from that, they were just a single career, middle class family with health insurance. So they weren't super rich. They weren't sending their kids to the Menninger Clinic or Chestnut Lodge or any of these private resort-like places. And they also weren't super poor. So they weren't, for the most part of the jail to the street revolving door that we see happening so much more and more now. And so it's one very particular kind of story. But what Hidden Valley Road doesn't touch on is the whole other story, the idea that our biggest mental health providers are quite often jails, that people don't really get consistent medication or other therapy unless they're incarcerated. And it's just devastating what's happening there. There could be a whole other book about that and about people going through that. And there's some excellent books about that.
Right. I have so many questions in my mind, but the one thing that stays with me is that I think of it as sort of the miracle of these two daughters who, despite what they went through, and they came out in kind of opposing ways of dealing with it, which you could talk about. But I just think it's kind of amazing that Mary Lindsay, they want to change her name to Lindsay, her discovery of the medical records, I think she's the one who finds that her mother was hiding the medical records. Just amazing that, that the two sisters end up kind of thinking about a book and kind of leading the effort to, talk to you and kind of to ignite this process of the book. And I think without them, the book wouldn't have happened. And they so easily could have shut the door, completely disowned the rest of the family, and left it. But yet, I think the book is there because of these two daughters, right?
Absolutely. And I asked them both that question, and some of the brothers, I asked it too. Many, many times over the years I was working on the book, I asked, you could have changed your name, left town, gone to LA, become a lawyer, sent Christmas cards every year, and that would have been that. But you're back. You're living in Colorado. You're seeing everybody. With Lindsay in particular, you're the chief caregiver for the remaining mentally ill brothers. That's a full-time job and over and above your current full-time job. Why would you do such a thing? And it becomes this sort of lesson in how to process some of the worst trauma you could experience. Both sisters have been abused. Both sisters have spent decades doing various forms of therapy to move through it. And they, as you said, have processed it differently. When I first talked to Lindsay and to her sister Margaret, I thought that it would be, I came away from that thinking I would be writing a book about two sisters who huddled together and were each other's greatest resources of strength to get through one of the most difficult childhoods you could ever imagine, and that would be a major part of the book. But then as I started to do one-on-one interviews and visiting in person, I quickly learned that they were processing the things differently, and that sometimes they were a great help to one another, but other times they were clashing with one another. And this is just like the medical conversation we were having a minute ago, where it's just things, real life is rarely a cookie cutter story. It's rarely pat, it's often complicated. And if you lean into the complications, it's a much richer story. I mean, Lindsay did whatever she could to get out of that house, and then finds herself back in Colorado taking care of her brothers. And Margaret got airlifted out of the house by benevolent, wealthy benefactors, and then spent many years feeling abandoned by her family, and then moved through processing the traumas of her childhood in an entirely different way that involved her setting up some personal boundaries, so that she made the decision not to do the caregiving to the extent that Lindsay did. And yet she also articulates what she went through her art in a way that nobody else in the family seems able to do. So you get a whole wide variety of human experience here, looking at both sisters.
Right.
And these days, the older sister really has a lot to say to people about how to move through trauma, and the younger sister, Lindsay, has a lot to say to people about the mental illness and mental health policy in the United States. They both have important mountains that they're climbing now that are independent of one another.
Right. That moment when I guess it's Mary, when she's left in the house, when Margaret gets the gift of this wealthier family taking under their wings and getting into a fine school and taking her out of the house, and Mary is left, is just, as a reader, I was just so taking a deep breath and thinking, what's going to happen to her? She's the only girl left, and she feels like her abandoned by her sister in a way that this happened. She's very young at that point. Is she 7 or 8 or 9? She's still very young.
Yes.
And yet she's yet she's the daughter who somehow is the one who's kind of like the surrogate mother at the end of the story in a way. I'm just really kind of, you can't make it up, right? It's brilliant.
Yeah, and then Margaret's saga is also, it's something out of Charles Dickens, where this wealthy family takes her in, and she views them with skepticism and can't completely trust the situation, and feels kicked out of her family. She can't understand why her mentally ill brothers are still at home and she can't be at home. It's this luxurious atmosphere where she's being given all the great privileges that anybody would ever want, and she knows she should be grateful, but she also feels like she's being punished. It's also a very peculiar story for her as well. Everything's larger than life with this family.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
Because I was very fascinated by the Gray family. That's their name, right?
Mm-hmm. Gary.
Yeah. Was I reading more into it, which I'm sure is very possible, or I was always expecting, there seems something a little unseemly about them, or maybe the father, that, on the one hand, benevolent on the surface, but were you kind of suggesting that there was something possibly or potentially or actually going on that was not as clearly just benevolent?
Well, there's a certain aloofness to their to their, perhaps out of necessity, but to the way that they were treating everyone. They were, they say to Margaret, yes, come in, be a part of our family, stay in our house, and we'll send you to our private school. And then they say to the other sister, oh, well, you're not old enough for the private school, so we won't take you, even though they could still take her. There's just a lot of capriciousness that seems a little weird. Also, there was a period where the Garys, as a couple, were really good friends with Don and Mimi, with the Galvins, and they did stuff together. They went on trips together. They hung out. They played tennis. They talked politics. And yet that all sort of fell away in later years, and it's hard to explain that away. Nobody has a good explanation for it, even though they did this amazing, generous thing. And so there are certain unanswered questions there that make the whole thing feel a little tenuous.
Mhm.
Well, I think that is about it for us, but just, what a rich story, and what a great job, Bob, you've done to kind of make it all one whole reading experience. This is so enriching. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, for spending this time with us. And Seth, thank you so much for your smart questions, and very grateful about that. So thank you all for watching tonight, for engaging. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of the week and the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you, David, and thanks everyone. I really appreciated this.
Take care, Bob.
Thanks, you too.